The chalk snapped in half the moment Grace Fairfield slammed it against the board. She did not mean to do it. She had been standing there for nearly 10 minutes, trying to keep her voice level while Marshal Weston Calloway sat in the third row of the small schoolroom with his hat on the desk, and his dark eyes fixed entirely on her face, rather than on the arithmetic problem she had written out in large, careful numerals. She could feel his gaze like a brand pressed against her skin. She had felt it every single day for 6 weeks, and today, for reasons she could not fully articulate, she could not bear it 1 second longer. "Marshal Calloway," she said, keeping her voice quiet, keeping her dignity intact because dignity was the only thing she had left in this crumbling town where she knew nobody and nobody knew her. "What is the answer?" He blinked. His eyes moved finally to the board. She watched him stare at the problem. 47 minus 19. A problem she had written for a man who had told her, flatly, upon hiring her, that he had never had the benefit of a proper education, and that he intended to learn everything she could teach him. A problem she had already explained 3 times during this session alone. "I did not catch it," he said. "You were not watching," she said. "I was watching," he said, and there it was. He said it without embarrassment, without apology, with that same quiet honesty that she had come to understand, was simply the way Weston Calloway moved through the world. He was a man who did not lie, even when the truth was wildly inconvenient. Even when the truth turned the air between them into something charged and dangerous, and absolutely forbidden given the circumstances under which she had arrived in Redemption, Nevada, in the spring of 1878. Grace set down the 2 halves of the broken chalk and pressed her palms flat against the front of her skirt. Her heart was doing something she would not permit herself to name. "You were watching me," she said. "Not the lesson." "Yes," he said. "Marshal, I was hired to teach you. I know." "Then you understand that you are wasting my time and yours when you refuse to apply yourself to the material." He looked at her for a long moment, and there was something in his expression that she recognized instinctively as honesty of a different and far more complicated kind. "I do not think I am wasting my time," he said. And that was the moment she understood that the situation had progressed far beyond what she was prepared to handle. That was the moment the trap she had not seen being built around her, slowly, lesson by lesson, day by quiet day, became visible in its entirety, and she had to go back to understand it properly. She had to go back to the beginning. Grace Fairfield had arrived in Redemption on the 14th of March, 1878, on the afternoon stage from Carson City. She had $37, a carpetbag containing 2 dresses, a small collection of books, and a letter of introduction from a woman named Mrs. Adelaide Hartley, who ran the only teachers' bureau in Nevada that placed women in rural postings without requiring them to be accompanied by a male guardian. Mrs. Hartley had been very clear in her letter that Redemption needed a tutor for an unusual student. The town's marshal, Mrs. Hartley had written in her careful, looping script, is a man of 31 years who came to his position without the benefit of formal education. He is highly regarded in the community and has expressed a sincere desire to learn reading, writing, and arithmetic so that he may better serve his duties. He is willing to pay $2 per week, plus room and board at the Meridian Hotel. The work is private, not in a classroom setting, and you will be reporting directly to the marshal himself. Grace had read the letter twice, then a third time. She was 26 years old and had been teaching since she was 19, first at a girls' school in Sacramento, then at a boarding school in San Francisco, where she had made the catastrophic mistake of falling into what she had believed was a mutual understanding with the headmaster's nephew, a man named Frederick Osman, who had very clear ideas about what a young woman in her position owed him in exchange for his affections. When she had made equally clear that she owed him nothing of the sort, he had arranged, through his uncle, for her to be dismissed on grounds of insubordination. She had no references beyond Mrs. Hartley's bureau. She had no family beyond a sister in Oregon who had her own troubles. She had no options except the ones that came to women who found themselves alone and without resources in a country that was not particularly interested in the welfare of such women. So she had taken the posting in redemption and tried not to think too carefully about what she was walking into. The stage pulled up to a building that served simultaneously as a post office, a general store, and what appeared to be a barber shop, and Grace stepped down into the red Nevada dust and looked at the town. Main Street was one long line of wooden buildings that had the look of having been thrown up in a hurry sometime in the last decade. There was a hotel, a saloon, a livery stable, a church that needed painting, a land office, a hardware store, and at the far end of the street, a building with a star painted above the door that she took to be the Marshal's office and jail. A woman in a calico dress was sweeping her porch and watching Grace with open curiosity. A boy of about 12 was sitting on the steps of the general store eating a biscuit. And leaning against the post outside the Marshal's office, arms crossed, watching the stage with the careful, unhurried attention of a man who had learned to read situations before they became problems, was a man she had not yet met, but somehow already understood was the man she had come to teach. He was tall. That was the first thing. Tall and lean in the way that comes from a life lived largely outdoors, with shoulders that had some real width to them and hands that were visibly large even from a distance. He had dark hair and darker eyes, and he was dressed plainly in dark trousers, a gray shirt, and a leather vest with the Marshal star pinned to it. He wore a revolver on his hip with the ease of someone who has carried one for so long it has become as natural as an arm. He walked toward her the moment the stage stopped, and his stride was unhurried but direct, and she had the immediate impression of a man who did not waste motion. "Miss Fairfield," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. "Marshal Calloway, I assume." "Weston," he said. "Or Marshal, whichever suits you. I'm grateful you came." He reached for her carpet bag before she could protest, and there was nothing aggressive in the gesture, only the reflexive courtesy of a man who had been raised to carry things for women, and she found herself relinquishing it without argument. "I have you at the Meridian Hotel," he said. "I hope the accommodations will do. It is not much, but Mrs. Perkins keeps a clean house and feeds her boarders well." "It will do perfectly," Grace said. He glanced at her with a look she could not quite interpret. It was not rude, not forward in any way she could have objected to, but it was thorough, in the way that a man who assessed potential threats for a living might look at something he could not immediately categorize. She lifted her chin and looked at the hotel. "When shall we begin?" she asked. "Tomorrow morning, if it suits you," he said. "I have a room at the back of the jailhouse I use as an office, quiet enough. I thought we could meet there mornings before the town gets too active." "That will be fine," she said, and it had been fine. It had been completely, professionally fine for the first 2 weeks. She had assessed his abilities quickly and found that he was not, as she had sometimes encountered with adult students, resistant or ashamed. He sat across the table from her each morning with genuine attention, and worked through the exercises she gave him with the same methodical seriousness he seemed to apply to everything. He could write his own name and a handful of common words, and his reading was at a very basic level, enough to make out posted notices, but not enough to parse a legal document or a letter with any ease. His arithmetic was purely practical, the kind of mental calculation you develop when you spend years managing your own affairs, and he could add and subtract reasonably well in his head, but struggled with anything that required him to track numbers on paper. He was an excellent student in all the ways that mattered, except the one way that began to matter more and more as the weeks passed, which was that he had a tendency, increasing in frequency with every session, to stop paying attention to whatever she was explaining and simply watch her instead. She noticed it the first time at the end of their fourth session, when she looked up from the page she was reading aloud to him and found him looking at her mouth rather than at the words on the page. She finished the sentence. He did not respond. She said his name. He came back from wherever he had been with a brief, visible effort. "Apologies," he said. She had let it go. The second time was during their second week, when she was explaining how to form a lowercase letter G, a task that required her to lean forward and guide his hand with hers across the paper, and she made the mistake of looking up and finding his eyes directly on her face at a distance of perhaps 14 inches. She straightened immediately and stepped back, and neither of them said anything about it. But the air in the small office was different after that, and she could not pretend otherwise. By the end of the fourth week, the watching had become a consistent, unavoidable feature of their sessions. He was not crude about it. He was never inappropriate, never spoke of it, never made any gesture that she could have called a transgression. He simply watched her with a quiet, focused intensity that made it very difficult to concentrate on fractions. She had tried several strategies. She had tried addressing him more formally, hoping that a cooler professional tone would remind them both of the terms of their arrangement. She had tried rearranging the room so that the morning light came from behind her rather than in front, making it harder for him to see her expression. She had tried speaking more quickly, and packing the sessions so full of material that there was no natural pause in which he could simply stare. None of it had worked. And now here they were, 6 weeks in, with the chalk in 2 pieces on the board and the arithmetic problem unanswered, and he had just told her plainly that he did not think he was wasting his time. "Marshal Calloway," she said, very carefully, "I need you to understand that this arrangement is a professional one." "I know that," he said. "Then you understand why it is not appropriate for you to sit there and look at me instead of doing the work." "I understand why it makes things difficult," he said. "I am not trying to make things difficult." "What are you trying to do?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside, she could hear the street beginning to come alive, the sounds of boots on boardwalks, a horse being walked, someone calling a name from one end of the street to another. "I am not entirely sure," he said. "That is the honest answer. I am sorry if it is not a satisfying one." Something tightened in her chest. She picked up one of the broken pieces of chalk and turned it over in her fingers. 47 minus 19, she said. He looked at the board. 28, he said without pausing. She blinked. "You already knew the answer," she said. "I have known the answer every time," he said. "I am not as poor a student as I have appeared." She stared at him. The understanding arrived slowly at first and then all at once, and with it came something that she could not entirely decide was outrage or something else entirely. "You have been pretending not to follow the lessons," she said. "Not always," he said, and there was something in the set of his jaw that she had not seen before, something that was not quite embarrassment but was adjacent to it, something that was the closest she had ever seen Weston Calloway come to looking vulnerable. "In the beginning, I genuinely needed instruction, but yes, for the last 2 weeks or so I have been slower than I needed to be." "Why?" she asked. He looked at her directly, and she was beginning to understand that this was simply how he was, that he did not have the social mechanism that most people deployed to deflect uncomfortable truths. Because when you are not here, "The mornings are very long," he said, "and I have not wanted to reach the end of what you have to teach me." Grace stood very still. The morning light was coming through the dusty window at a low angle, and the small room smelled of the cedar of the desk and the lamp oil from the lantern on the shelf, and something she had come to recognize as simply the particular atmosphere of this room. This hour, these mornings that had become the best part of her day in a way she had been firmly refusing to acknowledge. She sat down in her chair. She did not know what to say. "You should have told me," she finally managed. "Yes," he said, "I should have. We could have moved forward to more advanced material." "Yes," he said again, "the situation would have been considerably less complicated." "Yes," he said, and now something that was not quite a smile crossed his face, not humor exactly, more like the rueful recognition of a man who is aware that he has handled something badly. "I am aware of that." She looked at the board. She looked at the two halves of chalk. She looked at her hands. "Marshal Calloway," she said. "Weston," he said, "if you would." She felt the small concession of that name in a place she was not going to think about. "Weston," she said. "I came here from San Francisco, and I will tell you plainly that I came here because I had no other acceptable options, and that my situation is one in which I cannot afford to make decisions with my heart rather than my head. Whatever the mornings have been for you, they have also been the best part of my days, and that is precisely why I am telling you that this needs to remain what it is supposed to be. Do you understand me?" He was very still. "I understand you," he said. "I will also tell you that it is a substantial thing you just said to me." "I know," she said. "I said it deliberately, because you wanted me to understand the whole of the situation." "Yes." He picked up the pencil from the desk and looked at it. "Then I will tell you something in return," he said. "I have been a marshal in this territory for 7 years. Before that, I was a ranch hand. And before that, I was a boy who grew up on a hardscrabble claim in southern Utah, with a father who drank and a mother who worked herself to an early death. And I have spent most of my adult life making decisions by myself, without any particular guidance from anyone, and managing reasonably well. But I have never in my life met anyone who made me feel as though there was something I was missing until you walked off that stage in March, and I do not know what to do with that except to say it out loud." The room was very quiet. "That is also a substantial thing," Grace said. "Yes," he said. "I know." She stood up and went to the board and erased the arithmetic problem and wrote a new one, something harder, a multiplication problem with 3 figures, and she heard him pick up his pencil, and neither of them said anything else for the rest of the session. But the shape of the morning had changed entirely, and they both knew it. Redemption was a town of roughly 400 people in 1878, which meant it was small enough that everyone was aware of everyone else's business, and large enough that the illusion of privacy was sometimes possible if you were careful. The Meridian Hotel had 6 rooms, all of them occupied, and its proprietress, Mrs. Ida Perkins, was a woman of 60 who had come west with her husband in the 1850s, buried him in Colorado in 1863, and had somehow ended up in Nevada running a hotel with the serene efficiency of someone who has survived enough to find very little surprising. Mrs. Perkins liked Grace. Grace was tidy, paid on time, ate what was put in front of her without complaint, and did not bring trouble into the house. She was also in Mrs. Perkins's private assessment, about as lonely as a woman could be without showing it, and far too proud to admit it, and carrying some old wound behind those steady gray eyes that she had clearly decided she was done grieving. "You are getting on well with the Marshal, Mrs. Perkins asked one evening in early April When Grace came down to dinner and found herself alone at the table, the other boarders having already eaten. "Well enough," Grace said. "He is a quick study." "He is a good man," Mrs. Perkins said, setting a plate of beef and beans in front of her. "Lost his deputies to a fever 2 winters past and has been managing alone since. Town council keeps promising him additional help, but you know how that goes. He keeps this whole valley quiet more or less by the strength of his reputation alone at this point." "Is that so?" Grace said. "He has never shown particular interest in any woman in town," Mrs. Perkins said, with the casual precision of someone delivering a piece of information that they know is not casual at all, which some people have found puzzling. "He is a respectable age, has a steady income, owns his own house on the edge of town. Most men in his position would have settled years ago." "Perhaps he is simply focused on his work," Grace said. "Perhaps," Mrs. Perkins agreed, in a tone that indicated she did not believe this for a moment. The situation had a name. She knew what the name was. She was doing everything she could not to say it even to herself, because she was a woman without a safety net and safety nets. She had learned through Frederick Osmond's particular brand of cruelty: do not materialize simply because you need them. She could not afford to love someone who might not love her back in the ways that mattered, the permanent, practical ways. She could not afford another situation where she handed something precious to someone and found they did not know how to hold it. But Weston Calloway was not Frederick Osmond. She was aware of that with uncomfortable clarity. A week after the broken chalk, she changed the curriculum. She arrived at the office on Monday morning with a copy of a Nevada territorial legal code she had borrowed from the land office, and she set it on the table in front of him and told him that since his arithmetic was clearly more advanced than he had been letting on, they were going to redirect their efforts toward the reading and writing work that would genuinely be of use to him in his professional capacity. He looked at the legal code. He looked at her. "All right," he said. "You will read this passage aloud," she said, opening to a section on the legal procedures for holding a prisoner without formal charge, which she had selected specifically because it was directly relevant to his job. "And when you encounter a word you do not know, you will say so, and I will explain it." He read. His reading was slower than his arithmetic, genuinely slower, and she could tell by the careful way he worked through the longer words that this was not a performance. He read with a focused determination that reminded her of the way he walked, methodical and unhurried, and refusing to be stopped by obstacles. When he reached a word he did not know, which happened several times on the first page, he said so without embarrassment and listened to her explanation with complete attention. This was the version of the lessons she had imagined when she took the posting. This was the work she had been trained for, and she found herself genuinely engaged by it, explaining the legal terminology, discussing the implications of the passages, watching him work through the logic of the law with a mind that was clearly sharp and organized even without formal training. And he still watched her. But the watching changed in character now that they had both acknowledged it. It was less covert, less something that had to be ignored. Sometimes when she looked up from a passage and found his eyes on her face instead of the page, she met them directly and waited, and he would look back down at the page without apology, but also without pretending he had been looking elsewhere. It was an accommodation, she thought. A shared acknowledgement that something existed between them, and that they were both, for the time being, choosing to work around it rather than through it. The town council met on the first Thursday of every month at the land office, and Weston attended because it was part of his duties, and Grace attended because Mrs. Perkins had told her it was the primary social event of the month in redemption, and that the schoolteacher always attended, And Grace was the closest thing redemption had to a schoolteacher. She had not anticipated how the town would look at them together. She arrived before him and found herself a seat near the back, and when he came in 10 minutes later and the only remaining empty seat was beside her, he took it with the same unhurried directness he brought to everything, and she heard Mrs. Perkins, 3 rows up, make a small sound of satisfaction. The council meeting was mostly about water rights and road maintenance, and a proposal to bring a second saloon to Main Street, which the church faction opposed vigorously. Weston sat with his long legs stretched slightly to one side of the narrow chair, and his hat on his knee, and said very little, which she gathered was his habit at these meetings, waiting until something directly relevant to law enforcement arose before speaking. At one point she leaned toward him slightly to ask, in a low voice, whether the man speaking about the water rights dispute was the same rancher she had seen him arguing with outside the office the previous week, and he leaned toward her in return to answer. And for a moment, their heads were close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him, and she straightened and looked at the front of the room and thought very firmly about water rights. On the walk back to the hotel afterward, he fell into step beside her without being asked, and it seemed entirely natural for both of them. "You listened carefully," he said. "It is interesting," she said, "the way a town works. I have never lived somewhere small enough that the infrastructure is visible. It has its benefits," he said. "When something goes wrong, everyone knows about it and everyone helps. The drawbacks are the same." "Everyone knowing," she said. "Yes," he said. "I imagine that has been notable for you." She glanced at him. "You mean people being interested in the fact that I come to your office every morning?" "Among other things," he said. "Mrs. Perkins is very kind," Grace said. "She is," he said. "She is also the primary communications network for this town." "I am aware of that," Grace said. And despite herself, she heard the dry amusement in her own voice, and he heard it too. And something in his expression shifted, warmed in a way that she found she was not able to look away from quickly enough. They stopped at the door of the Meridian Hotel. "I need to tell you something," he said. She waited. "There is a man coming to redemption," he said. "A lawyer from Carson City named Harlow Dent. He has been writing to the town council about a land claim dispute that has been dragging on for 3 years, and he is coming to review the documentation and determine whether the territory has grounds to challenge the current claim." "I see," she said, not certain where this was going. "The documentation is in poor shape," he said. "Some of it is handwritten in a legal terminology that I have had difficulty parsing, and I have been managing the oversight of it on behalf of the council because there is nobody else to do it." "You want to be able to read it properly before he arrives," she said. "Yes," he said. "He is coming in 3 weeks. I have been embarrassed that I could not read it well enough to know what I am dealing with." She felt the particular quality of vulnerability in that admission. A man of 31, who had been carrying the weight of a town on his own for years, admitting embarrassment to her. "Then we will spend the next 3 weeks on legal documents," she said. "Show me what you have tomorrow morning." "All right," he said. He did not move immediately. The evening had settled, and the street was quiet except for the sound of the saloon at the other end of town, and the sky above the Nevada desert was the particular deep blue of late spring twilight that turned everything the color of ink and shadow. "Thank you," he said. "It is what you are paying me for," she said. "No," he said quietly. "That is not what I am thanking you for." She went inside before she could answer that. The next 3 weeks were the most intense of her professional life. And if she was being honest in the private accounting she kept strictly to herself, the most intense of her emotional life since she was 22, and still capable of believing that intensity was a sustainable way to exist. They worked through the land claim documentation together, and it became clear almost immediately that the situation was more complicated than Weston had indicated to the council. The original claim, filed in 1865, had been made by a rancher named Callum Hatch, who had died in 1871, and the claim had passed to his son, a man named Roy Hatch, who lived on the property and ran cattle on it and had been there, as far as anyone in Redemption was concerned, for as long as the town had existed. The territorial challenge was based on a provision in the original filing that required the claimant to maintain a certain level of improvements on the land. And there was a question about whether Roy Hatch had met that provision during a period in the early 1870s, when a drought had forced him to reduce operations. "This is not a simple administrative matter," Grace said on the second morning after she had read through the entire file twice. "This is a legal proceeding that could take his land." "I know," Weston said. "Roy Hatch has a wife and 4 children on that land." "Does he know the extent of the risk?" "Not fully," he said. "He thinks it is paperwork." She looked at him. "You are trying to understand it well enough to protect him," she said. "I am trying to understand it well enough to know whether he needs a lawyer of his own," he said. "Which he cannot afford." She read for a moment. "There is a provision here in the 1870 Territorial Code," she said, "that may supersede the improvement requirement if the claimant can demonstrate continuous habitation. The Hatches have lived there continuously. Do you have documentation of that?" He pulled out a stack of papers. Church records, school records for the children, a letter from the land office from 1873. She looked at them. "This may be enough to challenge the claim challenge," she said, "but you need someone who knows this area of territorial law to present it properly." "Harlow Dent is coming on behalf of the territory," he said. "He will not be presenting Roy's case." "No," she said. "But if you know enough to ask the right questions when he arrives, you can force the issue into the public record in a way that makes it harder to railroad." He looked at her with an expression she was becoming accustomed to but never quite comfortable with, because it was the look of a man who had just been reminded that the world contains resources he had not known he had access to. "You know a considerable amount about this," he said. "My father was a lawyer," she said, "in Sacramento. He died when I was 16, but I spent a great deal of time in his office before that." She had not told him that before. She watched him receive the information carefully, adding it to whatever accounting he kept of her. "I am sorry about your father," he said. "He was a good man," she said, and found, as she always did when she said those words, that they were both true and insufficient. They worked every morning and on 2 afternoons that week as well, and the sessions became something different than they had been. Less formally educational, more collaborative. She found herself thinking out loud about the legal arguments, and he found himself pushing back on her reasoning in ways that were sharp and well considered. And she realized with some startlement that he had a genuinely analytical mind, and that she had been, perhaps, underestimating him because his reading was slow. On the Wednesday of the second week, they were working late in the afternoon when his deputy, a young man named Tom Wicks, who had only recently been hired by the council to finally give the marshal some assistance, came in to tell him that there was a dispute at the saloon. Weston put his hat on and went to deal with it, and Grace sat at his desk and organized the papers while she waited, not entirely certain why she was waiting rather than simply going back to the hotel, except that they had been in the middle of something and she did not want to leave it unfinished. He came back 20 minutes later, settled the dispute, having apparently consisted primarily of his presence in the doorway of the saloon, and found her still at the desk. "You stayed," he said. "We had not finished the section on continuous habitation," she said. He took off his hat and set it on the hook by the door and sat down across from her. "Miss Fairfield," he said, "we established that you could call me Grace," she said. She had said this 2 weeks ago, after he had used the formal address one time too many in a session, and she had told him it was unnecessary given the circumstances of their daily acquaintance. "Grace," he said, and the way he said it was always somehow different from the way anyone else said it, as though the word had a different weight in his mouth. "I want to ask you something, and I would like you to understand that you can answer it honestly without concern for the professional arrangement between us." She set down the paper she was holding. "All right," she said. "Did you come to redemption with the intention of staying?" She thought about the question carefully. "I came with the intention of fulfilling the contract," she said, "which was 3 months, after which I intended to assess my options. And now," he said, "now it is 7 weeks in and I have not formed a clear intention regarding afterward," she said. "Is there anything that would affect that intention?" he said. "If it existed." She looked at him for a long moment. "That is a very cautious way of asking a very direct question," she said. "I am trying to be fair to you," he said. "I am aware that I am in a position of some authority over your employment here, and I do not want you to feel that anything I say or do is connected to the continuation of that employment. It is not. You have done the work you were hired to do, and you will be paid through the end of the contract regardless of anything else." "I know that," she said. "I want to make certain you know it," he said. "Weston," she said, "ask the direct question." He was quiet for a moment. "Is there any possibility that you would want to remain in redemption," he said, "after the contract ends?" She felt the question like a key turning in a lock she had been keeping very carefully closed. "There might be," she said, "depending on certain circumstances." "What circumstances?" He said. "Whether there was a reason to remain that was not merely professional," she said. They looked at each other across the desk with the papers between them and the late afternoon light going golden through the dusty window, and neither of them moved for a long moment. "I would like to take you to dinner," he said, "at the hotel on Saturday evening." "That is a very observable activity in this town," she said. "Yes," he said, "I am aware of that. Mrs. Perkins will tell every person in redemption by Sunday morning," she said. "Yes," he said again. "You are not concerned about that," she said. "No," he said. "I have thought about it and I find that I am not." She picked up the paper again. "Then yes," she said, "dinner on Saturday." He looked at her with an expression that she filed away carefully in the part of her mind where she kept the things she did not yet know how to name, and they went back to the documentation. The dinner at the hotel was, in the context of redemption in 1878, a very significant public declaration, and they both understood this. Mrs. Perkins made pot roast with roasted carrots and fresh bread, and a dried apple pie, which was as fine a meal as the hotel produced, and she set them at the best table by the window, and served them with an air of barely contained satisfaction that Grace found both charming and mortifying. He had changed his shirt. She had worn her better dress, the blue wool one that she saved for occasions, and she saw him notice it in the way he looked at her when she came downstairs. A brief, complete attention followed by a visible effort to arrange his expression into something more neutral. "You look well," he said. "Thank you," she said. "You changed your shirt." "I own two," he said. "This is the other one," she smiled. It surprised her. She had not been aware she was going to smile. They talked over dinner in a way that was different from the sessions, ranged more widely, moved through more territory. He told her about coming to redemption, how he had been passing through 7 years ago on his way to somewhere else entirely. She did not remember where, and the town had been in the middle of a crisis involving a gang that had been running through the valley, and the previous marshal had been killed. And he had stayed to help, and somehow the help had become the job, and the job had become his life. "Do you ever think about leaving?" she asked. "Not until recently," he said, and met her eyes, and she understood the implication and felt it settle in her chest with the particular weight of something true. She told him about her father, about the law office in Sacramento, and the smell of paper and ink that she had loved since childhood, and how after he died there had been no money for her to train as a lawyer herself, which had been her ambition, and how she had become a teacher instead, and found that she loved that too, mostly, except for the parts of it that required her to pretend to be smaller than she was. "You have never pretended to be smaller than you are in my office," he said. "No," she said. "I notice that. I appreciate it," he said. "I have very little patience for pretending." "I know," she said. "It is one of the things about you that I find most difficult." He tilted his head slightly. "A question." "Because it makes it very hard to maintain a professional distance," she said, "when you insist on being completely honest." "I will try to be more deceptive," he said, and there was enough of a dry edge to it that she laughed, genuinely laughed, and something on his face shifted in a way that she thought she would remember for a very long time. He walked her to the door of the hotel after dinner, and they stood on the step in the cool evening air, and she was aware, in a way she had been aware of increasingly in recent weeks, of how large and solid and simply present he was, and how that presence had come to feel something like safety to her, which was not something she had known she was looking for. "I want to tell you something," she said. "All right," he said. "I left San Francisco under bad circumstances," she said. "There was a man at the school where I worked. He had certain expectations that I did not meet, and when I made that clear, he used his family's influence to have me dismissed." He was very still. "He did not hurt you," he said. It was half question, half the very specific kind of flat statement that a man makes when he is trying to determine whether he needs to be angry on someone's behalf. "Not in the way you mean," she said. "He hurt my livelihood and my confidence and took 2 years from my professional life. That is all." "That is not nothing," he said. "No," she said. "It is not. I am telling you because I want you to understand why I have been careful, why I have been slower than I might otherwise have been. I am not fearful, I am simply aware. I would never use what I know about your circumstances to put you in an impossible position," he said. "I want you to know that, whatever happens between us, that is not how I operate." "I know," she said. "I have known that for a while." "I am telling you anyway because I wanted it said out loud," he nodded. "Saturday was the best evening I have had in a very long time," he said. "For me as well," she said. She went inside. Harlow Dent arrived on the Tuesday of the following week, on the morning stage, and was not what Grace had been expecting. She had imagined a slick, city-dressed man with an attaché case and a manner of easy condescension. What arrived instead was a small, neat man of about 50 in a good suit that had seen considerable travel, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, and a manner that was polite but not obsequious. He came to the Marshal's office first thing, as protocol required, and Weston introduced Grace without explanation, simply as Miss Fairfield, who had been assisting with the documentation review. Dent shook her hand with a brief, professional precision and asked, in passing, whether she had legal training. "My father was a lawyer," she said. "I have been working with the Marshal to familiarize himself with the relevant territorial statutes." Dent looked at the organized stack of documentation on the desk, the annotated pages, the notes in Grace's hand alongside Weston's more labored but increasingly legible handwriting. "This is more thorough than I expected," he said. Marshal Calloway is thorough, Grace said. Dent spent 2 days reviewing everything, and on the third day held a formal meeting at the land office with Weston, Roy Hatch, and the members of the town council. Grace was not present at the meeting, but she was in the hotel when Weston came to find her afterward, and she could tell immediately from the way he walked through the door that it had gone well. The challenge was dismissed, he said. Dent agreed that the continuous habitation provision superseded the improvement requirement and recommended that the territory close the matter. She let out a breath she had been holding for 3 weeks. Roy Hatch keeps his land, she said. Roy Hatch keeps his land, he said. He was looking at her with an expression she could not quite translate, full of something that was not only relief. You told me where to look, he said. I would not have found that provision. You would have, she said. Eventually. Grace, he said. You would have, she said firmly. He shook his head slightly, not in disagreement exactly, but in the manner of a man who has decided not to argue a point and is willing to let it go. Dent asked about you, he said. Whether you were employed in a permanent capacity. What did you tell him? I told him that was currently being determined, he said. She met his eyes. Is that accurate? She said. I believe so, he said. She crossed the room and stood directly in front of him, which she had never done before, and looked up at his face, and he looked down at hers, and the particular quality of the space between them was different now, all the pretense stripped away. Weston, she said. Grace, he said. I want to stay, she said. I want that to be the decision, but I want to know what I am staying for. I want it to be clear between us. It is clear to me, he said, but I should say it plainly if you need me to. I need you to, she said. He reached out and took her hand, and his hand was warm and large and held hers with the same careful, deliberate attention he brought to everything. I want to court you properly, he said. With the intention of asking you to marry me if you are willing, and if the courting confirms for both of us what I already believe is the case, which is that you and I belong in the same life. She felt the words go through her like light through glass. That is very clear, she said. Good, he said. Yes, she said. The answer to the part that is actually a question is yes. He raised her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips to her knuckles, and the gesture was old-fashioned and formal, and she found it devastating in the best possible way. And she thought that Frederick Osman, with all his city manners, had never made her feel a fraction of what this man managed to convey in a single, quiet gesture. The town watched them with undisguised interest. Mrs. Perkins had been telling people for weeks, it turned out, and the fact that the Marshal was courting the Tutor was received, on the whole, with the kind of warm approval that a small community gives to the private lives of people it has decided to endorse. Several women stopped Grace on the street to tell her how glad they were that Weston had finally found someone. A rancher named Pete Callender slapped Weston on the shoulder outside the general store and said something in a low voice that made Weston look somewhere between embarrassed and satisfied. Roy Hatch came to the Marshal's office 2 weeks after the land hearing and brought a ham. He stood in the doorway with the ham under his arm and said, in the direct way of a man who is not comfortable with formal expressions of gratitude, that he understood that Weston and Miss Fairfield had done something considerable for him, and that if there was ever anything he could do in return, he would do it. Grace was there for this, and she watched Weston accept the ham with the same straightforward dignity he brought to everything, and she felt something that she recognized at last as the uncomplicated, unguarded love she had been refusing to name for 2 months. She said nothing about it that evening, but she thought about it walking back to the hotel, and in the quiet of her room she sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself, for the first time, to simply think the word without qualification. Love. She loved him. It was not a panicked or overwhelming recognition. It was more like finally being able to see clearly after looking at something through fog for a long time. It had been there for weeks. She had simply been making herself look away. The formal proposal came 6 weeks later, in late June, on the last evening before Grace's original 3-month contract was officially complete. She had known, technically, that the contract was ending, but in the context of the daily rhythm they had established, of lessons that had evolved into genuine discussions, of evenings that had become something she could not imagine her days without, it had felt somewhat abstract. He asked her not in the office and not at dinner, but at the house he owned at the edge of town, which she had seen only from the street. He had invited her to see it, which was itself significant, and she had come with Mrs. Perkins's knowing silence following her out the door, and found a small but well-built house with a good kitchen, and a sitting room with a bookcase that was almost empty, and a porch looking out over the desert that in the evening light was the most beautiful view she had seen in Nevada. They were sitting on the porch when he said it. He had been quiet for a few minutes in the way that she had learned preceded something he was organizing carefully in his mind, and she had been watching the last color drain from the sky and thinking about nothing in particular. "Grace," he said. "Yes," she said. "I said when I first asked to court you that my intention was to ask you to marry me if the courting confirmed what I believed," he said. "It has confirmed it, considerably." She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with the same steady, honest attention that had been the first thing she noticed, and the thing she had never quite been able to defend herself against. "I want you to be my wife," he said. "I want this house to be your house. I want to watch you take the books out of that shelf and fill it properly. And I want to have the kind of mornings we have had in that office for the rest of our lives, where you tell me what you know, and I tell you what I know, and we are both better for it. I want to spend my life in the company of someone I respect and trust and love." He paused. "I love you, Grace. I have not said it plainly before now because I wanted to say it at the right moment, and this is the right moment." She was quiet for a moment. "You have been watching me since the day I stepped off that stage," she said. "Yes," he said. "And you noticed everything," she said. "Yes," he said. "And you hired me to teach you, and then you forgot every lesson because you were too busy watching me." "Not every lesson," he said with that dry, honest precision that she loved. "I retained a considerable amount. I simply found you more interesting than the material." She turned to face him fully on the porch. "Weston," she said. "Yes," he said. "Yes," she said. He took a breath that she heard as the release of something he had been holding for a long time, and he reached into his vest pocket and brought out a ring, a small gold ring with a single garnet, modest and well-made and exactly the kind of thing she would have chosen for herself if anyone had thought to ask her. "Where did you get that?" she said. "I ordered it from Carson City 3 weeks ago," he said. "I have been carrying it since it arrived." She looked at it in his hand. 3 weeks, she said. "I wanted to be certain of the moment," he said. She held out her hand, and he put the ring on her finger, and she looked at it in the last light of the Nevada evening, and thought about Sacramento and San Francisco, and the stage from Carson City, and the desk in the small office and the chalk snapping in half in her hand, and thought that the distance between those things and this moment was one of the more extraordinary journeys she had ever made. "I love you too," she said. "I should have said it weeks ago. You said it in other ways," he said. "That is generous." "It is accurate," he said. "You are not a woman who does things carelessly. The fact that you stayed in all the ways you stayed was the clearest thing you could have said." She leaned toward him, and he met her halfway, and the kiss was quiet and certain and tasted like everything she had decided she was not going to let herself want, that she had wanted anyway, that she was going to let herself have now without apology. They married in August, a month after the proposal, in the church that needed painting, which had been painted by the end of July, because once the news of the Marshal's wedding spread through Redemption, the town had developed a collective investment in making the occasion appropriate. Mrs. Perkins made a cake. Roy Hatch and his wife, a warm, capable woman named Della, came and brought their 4 children. Tom Wicks, the deputy, stood up with Weston. A woman from the church named Margaret offered to stand with Grace, and Grace accepted gratefully, touched by the generosity of a town that had been welcoming her for months without her fully recognizing it. The ceremony was simple, and the minister was a straightforward man who did not elaborate unnecessarily. And when Weston said the words, he said them looking directly at her in that way he had, that complete and focused way, and she said hers looking back at him, and it felt like the most honest thing she had done in her adult life. "You are thinking about this very hard," she told him. "I am trying not to injure you," he said. "I appreciate the effort," she said. He looked up from their feet and at her face, and the expression on his face at that moment was one she would keep for the rest of her life, open and unhurried and fully present. The look of a man who has arrived somewhere he had not known he was traveling toward and finds it better than anything he could have planned. They moved her things from the hotel to the house that evening, a practical relocation that Mrs. Perkins assisted with great efficiency and considerable satisfaction. And the house stopped being his house and became theirs in the way that happens quickly when 2 people are well matched, with small negotiations about the arrangement of the sitting room and the discovery that she liked the window open at night, and he did not, resolved by the additional blanket that appeared on the bed 2 days later without either of them making a specific decision about it. She filled the bookcase. Not all at once, but steadily, as books made their way from Carson City on the stage, ordered through the general store, added to by Weston, who had discovered, now that reading was no longer a source of difficulty and embarrassment but a genuine pleasure, that he had a particular interest in history and in the accounts of legal proceedings in the Eastern courts that she found for him. Within 6 months, the bookcase was full, and a second one had been built by the same carpenter who did the mayor's furniture, commissioned by Weston with the same matter-of-fact practicality with which he approached all their domestic needs. The lessons continued, in a different form. She had taken on the actual teaching of Redemption's children in the fall, the town having finally committed the funds for a proper schoolroom in a building next to the church. And in the evenings, she told him about the day and what she had taught and the particular challenges of each of the 12 students who were currently on her rolls. He listened with genuine interest and occasional useful suggestions rooted in his knowledge of each child's family, and she found herself seeking his perspective in a way that made the teaching better. He, in turn, talked to her about cases in a way he had not had anyone to talk to before, working through the logic of disputes and the application of law with her as a thinking partner. And she brought her father's training to bear on the analysis in ways that he found consistently useful. On 2 occasions, she helped him draft official communications to the territorial court that he said afterward were better than anything he could have produced alone. Grace had not yet said it aloud to Weston. She had known for about a week, had been carrying the knowledge quietly, getting used to the shape of it. "I believe so," she said. Della smiled with the warm completeness of a woman who has 4 children and a profound belief in the fundamental goodness of new life. "He is going to be so happy," Della said. She told him that evening, after dinner, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp between them and the Nevada night outside the window. She said it simply and directly, because she had learned in a year of being married to Weston Calloway that the things that mattered most were best said without decoration. He was very still for a moment. Then he looked at her with an expression that was one of the most profound things she had ever seen on a human face. A man being reached in a place he had not known was there, filled up in a way that he had not known was possible. He got up from his chair and came around the table and crouched down beside her chair so that they were level and took both her hands in his. "Grace," he said. "Yes," she said. He pressed her hands to his chest and looked at her for a long moment without speaking, and she could feel his heartbeat under her palms, steady and strong and very fast. "Are you frightened?" he said. "A little," she said. "Are you?" "Considerably," he said. "And more glad than I know how to say." "We will manage it," she said. "Yes," he said, "together." She bent her forehead to his, and they stayed like that for a while in the lamplight. The Nevada night around the house, and the desert stretching out to the mountains, and all the space and quiet of the country they had both traveled long distances to find. The baby was born in October of 1879. A boy, delivered by the doctor who came up from the county seat at the news that the Marshal's wife was in labor, assisted by Mrs. Perkins and Della Hatch, who were both at the house and neither of whom was willing to be anywhere else. Weston spent the labor in a state of controlled anxiety that Tom Wicks later reported to anyone who would listen had been the most nervous he had ever seen the Marshal in 7 years of close acquaintance, which the Marshal declined to deny. The boy was healthy and loud and had, from the first moment, his father's dark eyes. Grace held him in the morning light after the long night was over, and looked at this entirely new person she had somehow made, and felt something she did not have words for yet. Weston sat on the edge of the bed beside her, and she put the baby in his arms, and watched him hold his son with the same careful, focused attention he brought to everything, looking at the baby's face with a depth of attention that was entirely characteristic and entirely overwhelming. "What do you want to call him?" she asked. "I thought we would decide together," he said. "We said that," she agreed. "What are you thinking?" He looked at the baby. "James," he said, "for your father if you would like that." She had told him over the past year a great deal more about her father, about the man he had been, the lawyer, the reader, the man who had loved his daughter and died too early. "James Calloway," she said. "Yes," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder and looked at their son in his arms. "James Fairfield Calloway," she said. "So there is something of mine in it as well." "Yes," he said. "Of course." James Fairfield Calloway turned out to be a child of considerable energy and opinion, which his parents found exhausting and delightful in roughly equal measure. By the time he was 2, he had formed a strong attachment to the deputy's horse, a gray gelding named Pepper, and an equally strong attachment to the collection of books on the lower shelf of the sitting-room bookcase, which he could not yet read but which he removed and stacked and rearranged with profound satisfaction on a daily basis. Grace returned to teaching in the spring following James's birth, bringing him to the schoolroom each morning, and setting him in a corner with a small collection of objects to arrange and rearrange, and finding that the students, who ranged from 6 to 14, regarded the Marshal's baby with a proprietorial affection that was touching and occasionally more helpful than she could have hoped. The school had 12 students when she started and 18 by the second year. The town of Redemption was growing, slowly but steadily, as the territory developed and the railroad extended and new families came looking for land. Weston, managing a growing town with a deputy and a half, because Tom Wicks had taken a partial posting in the neighboring valley, was busier than he had been in years, and the evenings at the kitchen table became more important than ever as the rhythm of the day that kept them both moving separately came to rest there, at the table with the lamp and the books, and whatever she had managed to produce for dinner on the days the school ran long. There were difficult times. A particularly brutal winter in 1880 that brought hardship to several families and required a sustained community effort that left both of them exhausted. A period in the summer of that year when a band of men with a history of violence came through the territory, and Weston spent 2 weeks at a sustained and focused alert that she found harder than she had expected to tolerate, not because she doubted his capability, but because she understood now, with a clarity she had not had before becoming his wife, exactly what he was capable of putting himself in the path of. They had one significant argument in that period, about the extent to which he communicated his plans to her before acting on them. And it was the kind of argument that two intelligent people who love each other have when they are both right about different things. And it resolved as those arguments do, incompletely in the moment and more completely over time, as they each adjusted their position slightly toward the others. The band was ultimately arrested through coordination with the territorial sheriff's office rather than by confrontation, and Weston came home from the final resolution of the matter to find Grace in the garden with James on her hip, and looked at her for a moment with a depth of relief that she felt answering in herself. "It is over," he said. "I know," she said. Tom Wicks had come by an hour before. "Are you all right?" "I am," he said. He took James, who grabbed immediately for his father's star with both hands. "I need to tell you something," Grace said. He looked at her. "We are going to need the second shelf cleared of the historical accounts," she said. "Or possibly an additional bookcase." He looked at her for a moment, and then understanding arrived, and the expression on his face was the same one he had worn 2 years ago at the kitchen table. That depth of gladness that she had come to know was one of the essential things about him. "Another baby," he said. "In the spring," she said. The second child, born in April of 1881, was a girl. They named her Clara, for no particular reason except that it was the name Grace had loved since childhood and had been carrying around waiting for someone to give it to. Clara was quieter than her brother and more watchful, and had her mother's gray eyes and her father's dark hair, and by the time she was old enough to sit in the schoolroom, she had an aptitude for reading that Grace recognized as exceptional, the kind of natural ease with language that makes a teacher feel they have been given a gift. James, 4 years older than his sister and deeply invested in his role as the person who had been there first, appointed himself her protector and instructor in all things practical, including riding, which he began teaching her on Pepper's back at an age that made Weston quietly anxious and Grace more quietly amused. Weston taught both of them to track, to read the desert, to understand weather, to build a fire and tend a horse and assess a situation before acting. Grace taught them everything else, which turned out to be a very great deal. James grew into a serious, methodical boy who would, she thought, make either a lawyer or a lawman, or possibly both. Clara grew into a child with a powerful curiosity, and a gift for argument that her father met with the same honest attention he gave everything, and her mother met with the particular satisfaction of recognizing yourself in someone. In the autumn of 1882, Weston was offered the position of county sheriff, a larger jurisdiction, a significantly higher salary, and an office in Carson City. He came home with the offer and put it on the kitchen table and sat down and looked at her. She read the letter. She read it twice. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "I want to know what you think," he said. "I think it is a significant opportunity," she said. "I think Carson City has a school that would benefit from a teacher of your wife's experience. I think it would mean leaving a town that has been very good to us." "Yes to all of that," he said. "I think," she said, "that you would do the job well and that the job needs someone like you." I would need to give an answer by the end of the month, he said. Then we have 2 weeks to decide, she said. They decided together, as they decided everything, through the same careful, honest process of thinking out loud to each other that had begun with a legal document about a land claim, and had become the primary method by which they navigated their lives. They talked to Mrs. Perkins, who said she had always expected it and was very proud. They talked to the Hatches, who said the valley would be the poorer for it. They talked to Tom Wicks, who had already heard and looked both proud and bereft. They moved to Carson City in the spring of 1883, a family of 4 with more books than furniture. And Grace found a position at the Carson City School within the month and found, as she had expected, that a larger school with more resources and more students was a terrain she moved through with the ease of someone returning to their native ground. Weston became county sheriff with the same methodical competence he had brought to everything, and the larger jurisdiction demanded more of him and revealed more of him, and she watched him grow into the expanded role with the quiet pride of someone who understood the full extent of what they were seeing. James was 11 when they moved and Clara was 7, and both of them adapted with the resilience of children who have been raised in a household where change was discussed rather than imposed, and where the adults in the house handled uncertainty with consistent, demonstrated steadiness. There was an evening in Carson City in the fall of 1884, about a year and a half after they had moved, when Weston came home late from a difficult day, a dispute that had required delicate management and had gone longer than it should have. And Grace was in the sitting room reading by the lamp, the children in bed, the house quiet, and he came in and hung his coat on the hook and sat down in the chair across from her and said nothing for a moment. She looked up from her book. He was looking at her. "You are doing it again," she said. "Doing what?" he said, though she could tell from the quality of his stillness that he knew exactly what she meant. "Watching me instead of attending to what you should be attending to," she said. "There is nothing I should be attending to at this particular moment except you," he said. She looked at him over the top of the book. "You never change," she said. "No," he said. "You sat in a schoolroom in Redemption and refused to do your arithmetic because you were too busy looking at your tutor," she said. "And 7 years later, you come home and sit across from me and do exactly the same thing. I have been told that consistency is a virtue," he said. She set the book down. "Come here," she said. He crossed the room and sat beside her on the settee, and she took his hand and turned it over and looked at it. The large, familiar hand that had held her own on the night he proposed, and had been the first thing James reached for in the world, and had built bookshelves and mended fences, and done every practical thing their life required. "I want to tell you something," she said. "All right," he said. "I think about the day I arrived in Redemption sometimes," she said. "I was terrified, though I would not have admitted it. I had nothing and I knew nothing about this posting, and I stepped off that stage and there you were." "I know," he said, "and you looked at me," she said, "like you were already planning to make me your whole problem." "I was not planning anything," he said. "It was not a conscious process." "I know that too," she said. "That is the part that was impossible to resist. You were not trying to charm me. You were simply paying attention." "I have always paid attention to you," he said. "I know," she said. "And I need you to know that it is the single best thing anyone has ever done for me in my entire life, simply being seen. Completely and honestly, from the beginning." He was quiet for a moment. "I should tell you," he said, "that when I sat in that office every morning watching you write on the board, what I was thinking was that I had no idea what I had done to deserve having you walk into my town. And I still do not know, but I am grateful for it every single day." She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the lamp cast its steady light across the books on the shelves and the photographs on the mantel and all the accumulated evidence of their years together. And outside, the Nevada night was wide and cold and full of stars. "We have a very good life," she said. "Yes," he said. "The children are well. Yes. The work is meaningful. Yes. And you are still watching me instead of attending to the thing in front of you. The thing in front of me," he said, "is you." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Then I suppose," she said, "that you are, for once, paying exactly the right kind of attention." He pressed his lips to the top of her head, and they sat there in the lamplight, and the night settled around the house, and redemption was 200 miles away and 7 years back, and the chalk was still snapped in half on the board in the memory of a morning that had begun a story she was living now, without apology, with gratitude for every unexpected turn that had brought her to this house, this man, this life. In the years that followed, the story did not stop, because good stories never truly stop. They simply become the lives of people who went on living them. James Calloway grew into a lean, serious young man who read law in Carson City, and argued with his mother about precedent, and argued with his father about enforcement, and was the most complete combination of both of them that it was possible to imagine. They had a third child, born in 1886, another boy, named Thomas after the deputy who had stood by them both in redemption, and who was now running a ranch in the next valley, and came to visit twice a year. Thomas Calloway was from his first breath the most cheerful member of the family, an easy, laughing child who had his mother's gray eyes and his father's steady temperament, and somehow managed to combine them into a personality that was simply a pleasure to be around, and who became, by common consent of the family, the person who kept them all from taking themselves too seriously. Grace's sister in Oregon wrote to her in 1887 to say she was coming to Carson City to visit, and arrived in September, a woman named Helen who was 2 years older than Grace, and had weathered her own considerable difficulties, and come through them with the particular steel of a woman who has refused to be defeated. She and Weston regarded each other with mutual respect from the first meeting and a warmth that deepened over the 2 weeks of her visit. And when she left, she told Grace, in the private language of sisters, that she was very glad you found what you found, and Grace understood that she was not only talking about Weston. In 1889, Weston was approached about a federal appointment, a position as a federal marshal for the territory, which would have meant a significant expansion of his authority, and not incidentally, a significant expansion of the demands on his time. He and Grace talked about it for 2 weeks with the same honest care they brought to everything, and at the end of those 2 weeks he declined, on the grounds that what he had in Carson City was worth more to him than the expansion, and that there were younger men better placed to take on the federal role, and that he was 42 years old and had spent 20 years in service, and intended to keep doing it, but on terms that allowed him to be home for dinner. She did not cry when he told her the decision, because she was not someone who cried easily, but she was not entirely without expression, and he saw it anyway, as he always did, with that undiminished, completely characteristic attentiveness. "You are relieved," he said. "I wanted it to be your choice," she said. "It was. But you are relieved," he said. "Yes," she said. "I am relieved. I have 3 children and a school and a husband I want to keep, and I am not ashamed of being relieved that you are staying." He came to her and took her face in his hands, very gently, and looked at her in that way that she had long since stopped trying to protect herself from, because it was simply the way he loved her, completely without deflection. "I am staying," he said. "I know," she said. "For as long as you will have me," he said. "Then you are staying for a very long time," she said. He kissed her, and outside the Carson City street was busy with the afternoon, and the house was full of books and children, and the accumulated warmth of a life well built. And whatever Grace Fairfield had feared when she stepped off the stage in Redemption in March of 1878, alone and without resources, and carrying nothing but her intelligence and her dignity, it had not come to pass. What had come to pass was this: a man who watched her instead of doing his arithmetic, who said plainly that the mornings were long when she was not there, who held her hand at the right moment and said the right words in the right order, and spent the next decade and more being exactly the same person he had been that first morning, steady and honest and simply, completely present. And a woman who had arrived in a small Nevada town, expecting nothing but the end of one road, and had found instead the beginning of another, longer, better one, with a man who had forgotten every lesson she tried to teach him because he was too busy watching her, and who had, in the end, taught her something she had not known she needed to learn, which was that being seen, truly and fully seen, was not a trap or a danger or a thing to protect yourself from. It was the most important thing there was.